Okay, all you DIY philosophers out there in YouTube land, and welcome to the Punk Philosopher's take on two reasons why the old Soviet Union was not communist. Now, you might think the punk philosopher, he's a relic of the 1980s when the whole issue of the Soviet Union ceased to be of any importance. Because, of course, it is true that the Soviet Union, or the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, I'll say the Soviet Union, has been defunct for about 35 years. At the time of making this video, it's 2024, so you do the maths. However, it would be nice, while it would be nice if you were right, you're wrong. And I'm going to use these placards here to go through an inference which shows why you were wrong and why you should watch this vlog, because we're going to go through an inference that is you'll still see around quite a bit today in both popular and academic contexts about how the demise of the Soviet Union means there is no alternative to capitalism. Now, once I've used these cards, I won't be using the visual of the component of the vlog much more. I'm sure you've got an idea of what I look like and who I am. So you can toddle off and do the dishes and negate the difference between philosophy and domesticity, which the punk philosopher completely approves of. One reason why I use the old toilet brush as a pointer here, as well as that, because I think that a lot of the positions, the couple of the positions we're going to discuss here, are kind of crap. But anyway, nonetheless, they are influential. So let's get into it. So in the late 1980s, a frame of mind, I guess you'd say, arose called triumphalism. And this was a recognition of the fact that by that stage it was clear that the Soviet Union's Western competitors, openly capitalist states, liberal democracies, most of them like the United States, Australia, where I am at, a lot of them under the banner of NATO, an organisation formed in 1949 to oppose the Soviet Union in Europe, had outlasted the Soviet Union, which at that stage was winding up. There was an element in triumphalism that this was a good thing, even an element of glee, one would say. But we can just concentrate for the moment on the idea that the Soviet Union was winding up, and that her openly capitalist Western competitors had triumphed over her. The Soviet Union and Russia's always a her, like in the Sisters of Mercy song. I'll put a link below, and I'm happy with that. Okay, so, and this was supposed to give us Tina. There is no alternative. Tina, not Tina Weymouth or Tina Turner, both musicians of which the punk philosopher is a fan, but there is no alternative to capitalism. Tina, like triumphalism, Tina was a concept popular in the 1980s. Actually, probably predates triumphalism to some extent, and was made popular in earlier to mid 80s UK politics, especially. There is no alternative. So triumphalism is supposed to not be such a bad thing in that it gives us Tina, and it's time we recognise there is no alternative, that we got rid of our utopian socialist fantasies and buckled down to get capitalism working. There is no alternative. Of course, now in 2024, that might be reasons to kind of go, oops, it didn't really quite work out as expected, right? Like World War III, ecological collapse and other things looming, which I think we can beat if we do recognise that there is an alternative to capitalism. But perhaps I'm injecting my own viewpoints here too much. Let's just stick to the point. Triumphalism was taken to give us Tina. However, this inference seems a bit weak, and the reason why is because there have been a number of nation states that have failed, and their competitors have triumphed over them, but people haven't thought that led to Tina. So, for instance, Rhodesia, pretty much, its dying gasps were a bit longer than those of the Soviet Union, but it wound up by 1979, and it wasn't as though people went around going Tina because Rhodesia wound up. On the contrary, Rhodesia was an openly capitalist nation. It was actually named after a capitalist and his company, a guy called Cecil Rhodes. And when it wound up, there was some triumphalism in national liberation circles, but equally people were going, well, if an open capitalist nation winds up, it might show us that there's a problem with capitalism, rather than leading us to Tina. There is no alternative to capitalism. And the poster boy in this way of thinking, in terms of national liberation struggles, though of course he was from the South American continent, was of course Che Guevara. I'm not a fan, but that's the poster boy of this way of thinking. Okay, so that doesn't really quite seem to fly. We need another. There's a hole in the argument, as they say. And the hole in the argument is filled with this idea that the Soviet Union is communist. The Soviet Union is communist, and she was outlasted by her openly capitalist competitors. Then that seems more able to give us Tina. Why? Well, the Soviet Union wasn't just one country. We'll come to characterise it shortly, but let's start off by saying it was a group of states in Eastern Europe, and it began, as we will investigate, in roughly 1925, maybe a bit later. So it had a 60 to 65 year lifespan, and that's quite a lot of effort putting into running a series of countries, right? 60, 65 years of running a series of nation states. So if it really was communist, then it looks like, we've got reason to believe that that communism doesn't work, and that when it's outlasted by its openly capitalist competitors, then maybe we can think about Tina. But I'm going to be arguing that the Soviet Union wasn't communist, and that puts the whole back in the argument, and then we can't go from triumphalism to Tina. And there you can see, supposedly, we're pretty high tech here on the Punk Philosophers channel. That implication is blocked, or that line of inference is blocked, and we can maybe conclude that there is a possibility of alternatives to capitalism, that we should be pursuing them. All right. So let's get on to the actual subject matter of the vlog proper, namely that 2 reasons why the Soviet Union wasn't communist. Okay, what is the Soviet Union and what is communism? Well, let's start with the second first. Communism is I'm just going to say it's not capitalism, okay, in an industrial and post-industrial context. There's been a lot of speculation, a lot written about what communism is and is not, but that's all I really need in order to block the inference to Tina. So that's where I'm going with that. Now, I say industrial and post-industrial context because actually for the vast bulk of human history, societies haven't been communists, haven't been capitalist, but I'm not going to say they're communist either, because I'm going to say that they're pre-industrial, and so they're not like a reaction to the worst excesses of capitalism, which I take communism to be. And I also say a post-industrial context because I think probably actual, real, existing communism wouldn't so much be about like massive bits of machinery powered by fossil fuels and nuclear power, but would probably be more about, say, for instance, micro power generation, and that's starting to sound more post-industrial. And I'll put a link to a zine called Solarpunk, which explores these ideas. At least the first few issues do. I haven't kept up with the last issue, but yeah, check it out anyway. Okay, some nice writing, some nice art on that e-zine site. Okay, so what's the Soviet Union? Well, there was a revolution that finished the First World War in 2000. In 1917, and it took about a year and a bit, about 13 months to finish the First World War officially, but that's what it did, and it was against the Tsarist regime, especially in Russia, a regime which basically combined the worst aspects of capitalism at the time with the kind of a feudal hangover, which wasn't very pleasant either, and add to that the horrors of war. And you got a revolution. It was spearheaded by soldiers and sailors on account of perhaps them feeling the most direct and lethal brunt of the First World War, but it certainly wasn't restricted to them. The whole country basically went up in arms. Now, if you want to watch a film about this, which does focus on the soldiers and sailors, check out Battleship Potemkin, and I'll put a link down to that. It's a brilliant piece. It's a brilliant piece of cinematic history, and you know the scene on the steps is just absolutely mind blowing. So watch that, and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. And I'll put a link to a book too. Put a link to a Trotskyist book. I'm not a Trotskyist, but it's not bad history. Okay, let's move on. So. At first, what we had there with this was a period of immense strife, and also a period of development in the arts and culture as well. But fairly soon it came to an end. I'll put a link to some of the interesting artistic and cultural things that came out of the Soviet Union, both biology, ecology, and the theremin. The poet Mayakovsky, who committed suicide, interestingly, by 1928, and that I think I always felt that was a very telling event, the suicide of Mayakovsky. I'll put a reference down to his book Cloud and Trousers, an amazing book of poetry, and I think that it was a real indicator that things had already started to bureaucratise, even before 1928. So that gives us a kind of a 60 to 65 year history for the Soviet Union, somewhere between about 1925 and about 1990. But give or take a few years, because nations and groups of nations don't necessarily wind up just overnight. Okay, so that was the Soviet Union. To begin with, the Soviet Union. Coming out of the turmoil of those early years, called itself the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's important here because it's a clear claim on behalf of the leadership of the Soviet Union that they're not capitalist. Now, of course, just because politicians claim something doesn't mean it's true. I mean, just because anyone claims something about themselves, that they're communist or rational or whatever, it doesn't mean it's true. And I'll put a link down to a parodic illustrated poem I've written about this in respect of communism. And yes, we can't just take this at face value. But certainly here is the claim that the Soviet Union is communist, which was, even though the openly capitalist rivals of the Soviet Union were suspicious, rightfully, although they were liars themselves, of course, the politicians and directors were liars themselves, but were rightfully suspicious of their rival directors and politicians. They, of course, because it was convenient for them, basically because it links to this, they simply took the idea that the Soviet Union was communist on board. After the about 53, 54, 55, 56, there's a lot of changes. 1953 to 56, there's a lot of changes in the Soviet Union, and it presents a kind of a nicer face, and it becomes the term becomes the state of the whole people, and I'll put a reference to how intellectuals in France responded to this, and it will give you some idea of what was at stake with this name change. Book chapter, I'll put a reference to a book chapter there, which is quite interesting in its own right for other reasons too. So yes, and so still we have this idea that the whole people isn't just the capitalist class. So still we've got this idea that there's a claim there by the Soviet leadership that they're communist, and this claim's being taken seriously outside the leadership, which I suggest is kind of will be suggesting is kind of a bit weird, and look, I don't think it matters that you have red flags and silly yellow stars. I don't want to bring in China too much into this, just to keep it simple. We can talk about China in the comments if you want, but simply calling yourself a communist party or saying you're communist, it just doesn't cut the mustard, right? The society has to run in a communist way in order for it to be communist. That is, given my definition, it has to not be capitalist. And guess what? The Soviet Union ran an economy. Now, that makes it capitalist. Okay, that makes it capitalist. I really should just turn off the camera here because that's that. It ran an economy which included wages, prices, and profit. Okay, you worked for a wage and you paid for things. And we can see how capitalist it is if we zoom out a bit, and we see the Soviet Union selling guns and cars to the world and throwing in girls. Okay, they didn't make hamburgers, but vodka, big deal. Okay, it's as capitalist as you can get, right? I mean, okay, maybe they gave a discount if they liked you on the People's Rifle. The people, what was it? The AK-47, the People's Rifle. It's capitalism. Okay, and we can see it both inside the way the Soviet Union worked and if we step back a bit. Now, an objection will be made here that, well, yeah, but there was a big welfare infrastructure state in the Soviet Union. Hey, guess what? There's a big welfare infrastructure state pretty well everywhere, including in the United States, even if it's not as centrally administered as it is here in Australia. And I've got another vlog I've made related to this subject matter where I talk about how welfare states are just a way to manage capital. So that doesn't cut any more mustard with me. I'm not cutting much mustard here, am I? But look, I don't get it. I don't get that argument, which we can call it socialism. Okay, I mean, if you go to Australia, where I am, you can see Stalinist-style high-rise blocks in inner Melbourne and in inner city, and in Redfern in Sydney, and I think it's in Collingwood in Melbourne, and I'm pretty sure they're still there. And they were there to house and feed the workers, or to house and feed the Reserve Army of Labour. That's which has its own use. Watch my vlog about that. So I can't see how that argument's very changes the fact that the Soviet Union ran on wages, prices, and profits, and was therefore capitalist. Okay, and had an international presence on the international global market. So I can't see, and this is from an early stage. I mean, it probably wasn't happening in 1924, but it was the infrastructure and the ability to do this was already being put in place, and I'm not going to argue that too much, but check out the book that I've referenced. There's some. Might put it a little bit later, actually, the book I've referenced about the history of the revolution and the early days of what became the Soviet Union. When did the Soviet Union really start calling itself the Soviet Union? Well, again, as with the nation states winding up, there's a period of uncertainty there, but the term USSR, which I've suggested is not synonymous with the Soviet Union, started to be used fairly early on as CCCP, which is USSR, but in the Cyrillic alphabet that's used in Russia and Eastern Europe generally, for the most part. So, well, not all of Eastern Europe, but a fair chunk of it. Okay, so I don't buy it just because the idea that the Soviet Union is not capitalist because there was a welfare infrastructure. I don't get that as an argument. It's one of the reasons I'm using the toilet brush to kind of point this out, because I think some of this stuff is really bloody stupid, and we were fed it, and and I'll mention this again, I think it became part of people's historical identity that they were involved in this struggle, victorious struggle against communism. But it's the idea that the Russian welfare state or the the welfare state of the Soviet Union proves this is just bollocks. Now, another perhaps more sophisticated version of the same argument is the idea of a command economy. And it looks like this term was invented, or at least popularised by a guy called Gregory Grossman, not to be confused with Heinrich Grossman, who had some overlapping interests with Gregory Grossman. But we'll be more interested in Gregory Grossman here. The idea there was that, like, Grossman defined a command economy in terms of a formal structure that intervened in the economy. Now, I think it's true that along these bases that the Soviet Union was a command economy, but what economy isn't a command economy? Of course, and Grossman to some extent did this. You can cut the cake differently by saying what you mean by a formal structure. But you're really kind of playing games with naming rather than maybe actually understanding what's going on with a certain economy. To give you an idea of what I mean by this, like a lot of economies are the result. A lot of economic activity all around the world to this day in all nations is a result of some kind of intervention. Now, this might be bailouts, as we saw popularised in the 2008 global financial crisis, and have been used since for related reasons. I won't go into why they're used, but they basically shore up the economy, or even the socialist infrastructure that we've already talked about, or if you take the formal structure loosely enough, you could even think about things like share buybacks. And in all cases, what we've got is a way of intervening in the economy so we don't wind up, at least not immediately wind up, in a really shit position as directors of some of the warring brothers and sisters that are the capitalists. You have different blocks of capital and that are involved with national infrastructure. So, yeah, I mean, it's not wrong to say the Soviet Union is a command economy, but it just doesn't prove it's communist. We've got to have another aspect of this, which is important to note, is that you might go, well, hang on, we're not really talking about laissez-faire politics with the command economy, and maybe that's true, and we'll come to that in a bit. But let's not get too. I don't think it's worth putting too much importance on the whole idea of whether or not there are commands issued or not, because why not? Well, it doesn't really change anything. I'm not saying that the idea is completely useless. I'm not saying Gregory Grossman's idea is completely useless, and we'll come to an interesting use of it when we come to the second reason why the Soviet Union was not communist. This is just the first, the primary economy of the Soviet Union, its official economy. We're going to come to a second reason, which relates also to the notion of a command economy. But the problem is that you're commanding the economy. Now, what are you commanding the economy to do? You're not commanding the economy to benefit chumps in, your Stalinist high-rises, or for that matter, your American suburbs, or your Stalinist high-rises that are in Redfern, right? Let alone in Moscow. You're actually responding to the economy in a certain way so that you don't wind up really badly off. So in other words, Her Majesty the economy is still in charge. You're just ameliorating the effects of her rule on you and your mates, basically. So let's not get too carried away with that concept. It's funny because the concept is applied very loosely. For instance, you can, in the last couple of years, I've seen it applied a few times to China, which is just a series of free trade zones. Again, dumb yellow flags and dumb yellow stars and red flags and all the rest of that rubbish notwithstanding. Again, I'll refer back to that parodic poem I wrote about this, which is linked below. But also, it's interesting, I was reading about a woman called Lindsay Duncanson in a sort of post-punk zine called TQ. And she does body prints of people and makes them into flags. Now that's the kind of flag that communism might have. If it had symbols, I think they would be more like surrealist, biomorphic, like indicating human beings' interaction with the broader cosmos, etc. Not these red flags and red stars and yellow stars and all that rubbish. So let's move on to reason number 2 why the Soviet Union wasn't communist, and that is the reason number 1 is the primary economy of the Soviet Union, the guns, cars, and vodka and girls. Reason number 2 is the black market, or the shadow economy, as Gregory Grossman called it. Now, the shadow economy is about as close to a laissez-faire economy as you're going to get, a black market. There's always going to be a black market. Why? Well, because as I suggested, there's always kind of interventions in the economy, and there's always going to be people who want to get around those interventions and get goods that those interventions are maybe either overpricing or even ruling out of court. Now, because of the nature of the command economy in the Soviet Union, which I will admit was quite extensive, but again, I don't think this really tells us that the Soviet Union was communism. There were a lot of things that today we don't really associate with black markets that were sold on the black market in the Soviet Union. And they included stuff like sugar, say for instance. And also tradie services. I mean, everyone's, look, in Australia, if you've got a tradie mate, sometimes you can kick them a slab and they'll, fix up your plumbing for you if you're lucky. But that was much more widespread in the old Soviet Union, and much more, the jobs were bigger, and it was more seriously illegal to do it, I guess, although people got away with it. Now, a black market is about as laissez-faire as you can get, because there's no state intervention. That's not that there's no interventions. I don't really believe in the idea of a laissez-faire economy, because contracts have to be enforced externally, and I'll put a link down to a vlog I've made about this, as well. But what you're talking about with the black market in the Soviet Union is probably about as close, or a black market anywhere, is probably about as close as you're going to get, really. The problem arises for this argument for the second reason, my second reason that the Soviet Union wasn't communist, the shadow economy, or black market, that it's hard to determine how important it was, because there aren't official statistics about it. Of course, there are ways we can do this, from talking to people who've lived in the Soviet Union, to having spies, to reading the media and so on. And Gregory Grossman himself was quite an expert on what goods could be obtained for what prices where in the black market of the Soviet Union. But that was later on that he this is into the 50s and later that he was that this kind of information was available. However, I have got a link to an article which I'll put below the vlog, which not only suggests that certainly in these later years, that after the 50s and so on, that the black market was important to the Soviet people. It also to the Soviet Union and running of the Soviet Union. It also suggests looks at some computer modelling where they can go back and you can see this has been the case for quite a while, kind of retrospective computer modelling of the Soviet economy. So that's reason number 2, a black market. A black market is not communism, it's a form of capitalism, right? So reason number 2. So again, I feel like I should just go and turn off the camera here. I mean, why are we even believing any of this bullshit, right? It's just, seems to me as dumb as the droppings of a canine, basically. So, but okay, there you go. There's the 2 reasons. The primary economy and the secondary economy of the Soviet Union, but neither of which are communist. The black market is quite an interesting phenomenon, and sometimes people look at it and look at other things that happened with the Soviet Union, and they talk about capitalism became it's inevitable, and so the Soviet Union wasn't communist because capitalism was inevitable. Well, if you hold that line, be careful, because then you can't hold the line that that it was communism and communism failed, right? So it's a contradiction there that people come up with. But people often don't think about this stuff very, very deeply because their historical identities are bound up with triumphalism, and so this often leads to some sloppy thought. So if you're discussing this matter, you might still find, to this day, 35 years later, sloppy thought around this. As concerns the black market economy, and to some extent as well the primary economy of the Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership didn't come out and say it was capitalism, and they denied the importance of the black market, which is why we had why there are problems gathering data about it. But wow, I mean, you can deny it all you want. Why believe these people, as I've suggested, and why, you know, especially given that, like, a lot of the oligarchs, we know a lot of the oligarchs, and I'll put down a link to, I'll find an oligarch. I've got a couple in mind. I'll see what I can find that's good on Wiki. A lot of the oligarchs actually made money in the black market, and you know, so. They later on became the capitalists that, when the facade of communism was dropped, who proved that the former bureaucrats were doing quite well out of it. The ordinary people were living because of the black market. So what's the point of saying that it's not official? What's the point of saying that? And likewise with the primary economy, what's the point of saying, well, we're officially communist when you're running on a capitalist economy as well as with the primary economy? So that's really all I've got to say about this. I think it's still important because people still go on about it, which is kind of regrettable. I think you've got to be careful of sort of slack thinking that's around it. But yeah, the Soviet Union was not communist. So triumphalism does not give us Tina. And because we don't have Tina, there is an alternative to capitalism, and we should start thinking about it. I'll make other vlogs and write other stuff about that. But let's certainly not assume that we're stuck with capitalism simply because the old Soviet Union was outlasted by her competitors. I agree as well. One last thing I'll say here is I agree that there are other problems with the Soviet Union, like for instance its terrible environmental record. I don't really concentrated on that because while that no doubt led to its demise, that would complicate things insofar as the capitalist competitors didn't really have a great openly capitalist competitors didn't really have don't have a great environmental record either. So I've just stuck with the idea of the Soviet Union being outlasted by its openly capitalist rivals, and yeah, I can't see how that tells us that there is no alternative. And I think if you look into it, you'll find that the Soviet Union's like Rhodesia is just a capitalist state, which didn't last where other capitalist states have lasted, at least for the moment, though time is a ticking, a tick-tick-tock. Okay, thank you.